Our next speaker is Dr. J. Buckley. Dr. Buckley is the author of the award-winning book, William Clark, Indian Diplomat. He also co-authored By His Own Hand, The Mysterious Death of Meriwether Lewis, and Zebulon Pike, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West. He's an associate professor of history at Brigham Young University. He served as the president of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation in 2011-2012, and he directs the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies. Dr. Buckley his paper is entitled Zebulon Pike and His Contemporaries, Intrigues Surrounding the Exploration and Mapping of Texas, the Southwest, and the Southern Plains. Please welcome Dr. Buckley.
Thank you. Thank you for coming back. I guess the bar is open, so don't fall asleep. Get what you need to, and we'll get with it. I'm excited to be here. I was talking to my table. It's a table full of Texans. I'm from a cattle ranch in Wyoming, so I fit in pretty well, especially when I thought back, well, from 1819 to 1850, Wyoming, or what became Wyoming, was actually Texas. So apparently I could claim that I'm from Texas. So I'm excited about this. Well, I hope you'll let me use the word contemporary loosely. I want to give a little historical context, and I love the talks we've had already today, and I hope that I can augment some of the things that have been said and also the things that were presented yesterday. I want to start out just introducing some of the key players that are going to be involved in some of the themes. First, I want to, as Dr. Barr had done this morning, recognize the native presence of indigenous peoples, past, present, and future. And also think about three general themes that I'll be addressing today. The first is to talk about Louisiana Territory's contested boundaries. Just what were they, how they came to be, and a lot of this is from the European and American perspectives. Just interlay this with the maps that you've had from Dr. Barr, and we'll be good. The second is exploring the purchase or defending the borderlands, depending on your point of view. And then some of the filibusters, revolutions, and impresarios after that. So this may seem like a funny place to start in the 1670s with Sieur de La Salle, but the reason I start with this is if you remember anything about the lecture, just know that from the 1680s until the 1830s, if anyone explored in New Spain and the Spanish found out about it, they're going to send expeditions to stop that exploration. They will confiscate the goods, they'll arrest the people, they'll take them to Santa Fe or Havana or Mexico City, sometimes to Spain, and often those people will be killed. So if you have a multiple choice and you're guessing what happened to the explorers, that's always a good one to pick. Now, La Salle, of course, isn't the first explorer to look in these lands, and as Dr. Barr's article in the You Can't Teach American History Without American Indian History reveals, a lot of these Europeans have blank spaces on these maps. So in a geopolitical cartograph like this one here, you see that certain areas are claimed by Spain and France and England without the indigenous populations represented. But the Spanish and the French do have a lot of native presence on their maps. But in some of the later publications, and particularly those of the British and the Americans, they seek to erase that presence. And they often will rename native places or other things in their own fashion. The reason why La Salle's starting point for me is because after he claims the territory for the King Louis XIV, there are at least 9 expeditions sent by the Spanish to go evict any French presence in what becomes Texas. There are 4 maritime expeditions sent from Veracruz and La Florida to make sure that nobody remains. There are 5 overland expeditions from Nuevo Leon and a couple other places. And so immediately the Spanish are saying, how can we get rid of competitors and how can we assert our own presence? And one of those, of course, is to settle. And in the 1716 era, they, of course, establish San Antonio de Bejar. The other thing I wanted to add on to this is the reason why these European nations are claiming these geopolitical boundaries is a legal and moralistic concept that they created to feel better called the doctrine of discovery. And basically it meant that any Christian nation that found a place that had not been claimed by another Christian nation could be the one to claim it. And you would do that by putting boots on the ground, often erecting a flag or other kinds of token of sovereignty, distributing medals, publishing those findings to other nations to show that you've already arrived there. So in essence, in 1803, when Jefferson's negotiating the purchase of Louisiana, he's not buying the land of Louisiana. He's not buying fee simple title or anything like that. That's still held by native occupants who still have ownership until that land is either retained by them or lost through just and lawful wars or by cession through treaty. So this notion of discovery is an important one because it helps us understand the mindset of what these explorers were interested in doing. Just a couple of examples to whet your appetite. Louis Saint-Denis founds Nacogdoches Natchitoches in Texas along the Red River, Louisiana. Is this going on automatic? Maybe it's just really sensitive. Try to also be more sensitive. In the 17 teens, founds Natchitoches and is involved in establishing trading relations. I didn't do that one. We see if we can take off the auto narration on that. Okay. Anyway, he travels across Texas all the way to Coahuila, and the response from the Spanish is to arrest him, confiscate his goods, and imprison him. The story is often that once these individuals are imprisoned, they need to get advice from someone higher up on what to do with them. That takes a long period of time. Honestly, I'm not touching anything. So. That's okay. Just hang with me. And one of the stories is that he was so long that he eventually married one of the senoritas in the town while he was incarcerated, and eventually she will join him in Natchitoches later on. But even when these individuals have passports or letters of introduction that would allow them to move in what becomes Texas, often the commandants at the local presidios or the towns can make their own decisions whether or not they're going to accept those passports or not. Okay, hopefully we can get this settled soon. De la Harpe, another explorer. My eyes aren't as good as they used to be. He was a French explorer of the Red River Valley, forms Fort St. Louis in 1719. The response, of course, is to send the Villasueur expedition to capture and arrest any French traders on the Great Plains. The next one, Peter and Paul Mallet. These French Canadians explore much of the Central Plains from the 1730s to 1750s. The thing that's interesting to me about this is that they're traveling all the way to Santa Fe. When they arrive there, they're detained for 9 months while news goes 1,500 miles down to the viceroy to ask them what to do. He also marries a woman in Santa Fe. He gets an official passport in the 1750s. This is Pierre Mallet, to travel again, and he's arrested again. Even though he has the proper documentation, he's sent to Santa Fe and then New Mexico. So again, this idea of confiscating goods, either sending them back home or taking them and imprisoning them and finding out what to do from higher ups is a very common theme that's going to play dividends in a few minutes when we talk about it. Well, we've made it almost 100 years already in 5 minutes. We're doing pretty well. How many of you have heard of the secret Treaty of Fontainebleau? Okay, a few. During the tail end of the French and Indian War, the French saw the writing on the wall that they were soon going to lose their North American possessions. They desperately did not want them to go to the British, and they hoped that they could get those to the Spanish instead. So a year before the official Treaty of Paris of 1763 that ends the war, they have a secret treaty between French and Spanish ambassadors, King Louis XV and King Charles III, in which the French cede their right of discovery that we talked about a minute ago to the Spanish, to be the sole sovereign nation who can interact with the indigenous peoples who have the right of occupancy in that territory. The reason this was secret, of course, is because they didn't want the British to know about it. It wasn't even revealed before the signing of the Treaty of Paris, ending the war. And the British were quite upset to learn that this territory that they hoped that they could spread even beyond the Mississippi River was now held by Spain. But when you look at that map on the right, you'll see that this is kind of the largest extent of the Spanish holdings as a colonial entity in the Americas. Their holdings stretch from Victoria Island until the Nootka Sound controversy a few decades later, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, and from the California coast all the way to Florida. This was an extensive territory that was impossible to either settle or to fortify. As a result, about the best that they could do was try to arrest and imprison and discourage people from exploring in those regions, or to use French or indigenous or other kinds of allies as buffer zones to try to prevent other nations from encroachment. This map, actually from 1757, which is part of a 3-volume work written by Dupratz on the Louisiana Territory, is an interesting one because not only does it show the native presence and villages along that way, but if you'll notice in the bottom corner, the boundary given by this French cartographer is the Rio Grande. Now, not too many of the maps of Texas use the Rio Grande as a border even until the 19th century. It's often a part of Coahuila or even Coahuila, Texas later on. But this map is an important one because this set of works and this map were carried by Lewis and Clark in their expedition in 1804 to 1806, which is an indication that at least in Jefferson's mind, he hoped to use this cartography to show that the purchase could be as broad as he had hoped it might be. The official Treaty of Paris in 1763, of course, uses the Mississippi as the primary boundary line. And you'll notice the East and West Florida, as we heard earlier today, was temporarily under British control, even though many of the communities are still indigenous French and Spanish in those areas. 20 years later, at another Treaty of Paris, this time ending the American Revolution, you'll notice that on this geopolitical map, some things have changed. There's a joint occupied territory between the British and the United States from the 42nd parallel, roughly the line between California and Oregon, all the way up to Alaska. The Spanish have been expelled from that part because of the intrigues resulting from the Nootka Sound controversy of the 1790s between the Spanish and the British. You'll notice that Spain's regained the Floridas because they were an ally with the Americans, and that is returned to them. But there is a contested ground on how far that Spanish presence in the Cis Mississippi area between the Mississippi and the Appalachians actually extends. And you look at the that crosshatched area there. This is going to be an ongoing boundary dispute for another 12 years or so until the 1795 Treaty of San Lorenzo, or Pinckney's Treaty, which identifies the 31st parallel as that southern boundary. When you look at the population of Europeans on the North American landscape in 1800, you see that the expelling of the Jesuits have brought a new Catholic order to town, in this case the Franciscans, who established all of the mission systems in California. The main villages in Texas are still San Antonio and Nacogdoches. And I think there was a census taken in 1804 of the Hispanic peoples in what became Texas, and the figure seems to be about 3,605 is in my mind, which is a fairly small number. And you think of how big Texas is, both now, but then this was a huge territory. Meanwhile, the French Revolution is raging, and a lot of changes are occurring. This American Revolution that had initiated this independence movement across the globe has now become a little more radical in France. In fact, Louis XV is beheaded. Other royalists are beheaded as well. And eventually, power is convalesced together in the figure of Napoleon. He's one of the greatest modern military generals of our time. And with this consolidation of power, Napoleon was upset that France had lost its New World Empire in 1762 and wanted to restore it to its grandeur. In particular, he wanted to reestablish the colonies in the Caribbean, which were his sugar islands. At that time, I think the sugar islands were bringing something like 40% of the gross national product of France. So it was a significant way to finance his armies. And he's fighting a number of wars with a lot of different nations. So he needs to get that going. And because the land's so valuable for growing sugar, you can't grow anything else because it would not be cost efficient. So he needed Louisiana as a breadbasket to feed those plantations with all of those enslaved peoples that are working them, so that he could make this triangular trade work out for France. So in 1800, to initiate this, he involves himself in another secret treaty, this time at San Ildefonso, and this is a retrocession of the lands from that had been ceded in 1762 in that secret treaty of Fontainebleau back from Spain to France. And this was an important moment in time because when Jefferson, who becomes president in 1801, learns about this, he sees that not only does he not have a weakened, crumbling Spanish empire on his western flank, but now he has a young, aggressive, militaristic French foe to potentially deal with. This was particularly important because from the San Lorenzo Treaty in 1795, the main issue for Jefferson and for Americans in general was to get the right of deposit at New Orleans, to have access to the navigation of the Mississippi. Because without the ability to take the goods from 2/3 of the nation and take them downstream, you're putting the country to severe limitation. Well, the right of deposit had only been granted for 3 years. And so when that right of deposit was rescinded or revoked, it created a real problem for the United States, and they had to figure out how they were going to make this change. So one of the things that the Spanish got in return was there was a little part of Italy called Etruria or something like that that would be recognized as a Spanish domain. Now, New Orleans was not only the center of this trade, but it also was important because the United States monetary system was not fully developed yet. In fact, they were using milled Spanish dollars as their currency. You've heard of the pieces of 8, right, with cutting the silver dollars into 8 pieces, 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar. And so this was an important way that money was interjected into much of the backcountry. And some of the people engaged in that trade were not always the most honest or circumspect in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. An example of that is one of the characters we'll look at more closely in a little bit, and his name was James Wilkinson. Wilkinson had been in the Revolutionary Army. He'd served with Benedict Arnold. He'd been involved in the Conway cabal to get rid of General Washington. By the early 1790s, he had made himself a deal with the Spanish that he would trade military secrets of the United States in exchange for money, upwards of 2,000 Spanish milled dollars a year. He, of course, did this duplicitously and secretively, and so people didn't find out about this. Even after he died, they didn't know the whole story about what was going on with him. But one of the challenges for sleuthing this together is that they would engage in both legitimate trade and contraband trade. And there were certain provisions on once you sold your goods, you were supposed to pay a certain percentage to the Spanish as a tariff or fee. And sometimes they would try to circumvent those by putting them in the bottom of their barrels or other kinds of things to dissuade customs officials. Napoleon, meanwhile, is in quite a dilemma because he initially thinks that he can take over the Sugar Islands and put down a French uprising that had been led by Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. And one of the challenges is he marshaled an army of 20,000 troops. He thought that would be more than sufficient to take care of things. And he sent them there, and they were attacked by hordes of blood-sucking females that decimated his army. They contracted yellow fever through mosquitoes. And that disease combined with the uprising was more than enough to prevent him from taking his dream to fruition. Well, if you don't have the Sugar Islands, then you don't need Louisiana as much. And this is going to open up discussions with some of the American officials. There's a slave plantation growing sugar cane. The third part of Napoleon's plan was he was going to send 20,000 additional troops to land at New Orleans. And then they could reestablish the French presence and take over all the administration that the Spanish had still been doing, even after the secret treaty in 1800. So as a result of that, he marshaled 20,000 troops and he placed them in the Low Countries of the Netherlands. And they were getting ready to embark for America when the North Sea froze over. So they didn't send those troops. And in the spring, he felt like the war with England was heating up so much that he couldn't spare those 20,000 soldiers anymore. So in effect, bugs and ice defeated one of the greatest generals in modern history. Well, this brings us, of course, to if there's no longer a need for a New France, Louisiana, and I haven't officially taken control of it from Napoleon's point of view, then why not sell it for some ready-made cash? And so the diplomats from America meet with Talleyrand and they negotiate a purchase. Initially, Jefferson had authorized the delegates to spend up to $10 million to purchase the port of New Orleans and the right for free navigation of the Mississippi. When they come back and say, would you consider $15 million for the whole of it? Well, they figured they could stretch their official task a little further and make that purchase. This brings us, of course, to the part we're going to spend the most time on, and that's exploring this region. One of the interesting things, whether this is anecdotal or not, is that when all of these treaties had been vague in their description of just how big Louisiana was. The 62, the 63, the 1800, the 1803, none of them really say it's this river to this river and this degree of latitude to this degree of latitude. So when they pressed for some clarification on this, the French ambassadors told Jefferson's ambassadors, well, you've made your purchase, you can make the most of it. The Spanish, of course, were furious because in the secret treaty in 1800, there was a provision that the land would not be alienated to a third nation. So if it is going to be sold or traded, we have the right of first refusal to get it back. So they were very disappointed in that. Moreover, their little fiefdom or kingdom in Echeria had not been officially recognized in Europe, so that had negated one of the provisions of the treaty. But nevertheless, the United States is going to claim 828,000 square miles, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian Shield. And as a result, there were a lot of people in the United States that were pretty upset with Jefferson. We learned a little bit this morning about his Empire of Liberty and this notion of extending American institutions and concepts. Here's a letter he wrote in 1804. I look to this duplication of area as a great achievement to the mass of happiness which is to ensue. Is it not better that the opposite bank of the Mississippi should be settled by our own brethren and children than by strangers of another family? One of the French philosophers that Jefferson liked a lot, especially in his thoughts about republics, was a man named Montesquieu. And Montesquieu's idea was that republics are very good forms of government because they allow a larger segment of the population to have opportunities to participate and be involved in them. But he said one of the challenges of republics is that they have to be small to function properly. The larger they get, the more unwieldy they become. So if you think of a bicycle wheel, the further you are from the center, the faster it's going to spin. And when you think about all of the independence movements where these colonizing nations had established and how they spin off the further they're away and the longer they're away from the metropole, you can kind of see that Montesquieu had something there. One of the key themes that Jefferson wanted to promote is there was a lot of opposition by the Federalists to this purchase. Before this time, Jeffersonians who had been kind of against the Constitution and wanted a very strict interpretation or reading of that document, he was reading it very generously to think that you could buy another country. He, of course, justified it by the provision in the Constitution that you could buy or acquire land by treaty or by just and lawful wars. This treaty was a land acquisition, and he was purchasing this right of discovery from France to be the sole sovereign power to interface with all of the native peoples who lived within the Louisiana territory. As a result, he needs to sell this in some fashion to appease the Federalists, who are justifiably nervous that by doubling the size of the United States, there was a good chance that all of that region would be settled from people from the West and the South. These aren't folks that have New England's interests in their mind. And the populous states like Virginia, who had already begun to dominate the presidency, and I think 4 of the first 6 presidents are all from Virginia because of its his population. They're justifiably worried that any new states that are carved out of this region will further alienate them. And it's quite interesting that almost every single part of the United States attempted or thought about seceding. The first area was New England, who, after the War of 1812, meet at Hartford and Connecticut and consider leaving the Union. There's an attempt by Wilkinson and Burr to separate the Mississippi area from the United States. We'll talk more about that. It never really happened. And then finally, the secession later on, following the troubles of the 1830s through the 1850s. But Jefferson wanted to sell this as scientific exploration, that it wasn't necessarily for God or country, wasn't to establish those other kinds of things, but as an Enlightenment adherent, he wanted to gather information that would be useful. You don't just need to know where the river runs, but you need to know if it's navigable. You want to see if there's these crazy things out in the West. I think I have a couple pictures here, maybe not. So over the course of the next 20 years, during the Jeffersonian period, there will be a series of expeditions launched by him or by the military. In this case, the principal or leading general of the United States from 1800 to 1812 was a man named James Wilkinson, the same guy I was telling you about who was in the employ of the Spanish and giving secrets. Can you imagine if the commanding general of the United States was selling information to other nations?
We haven't heard more about him.
You're here today. But this,
Benedict Arnold, you know.
yeah. Well, James Wilkinson, I think, is a greater scoundrel than Benedict Arnold, who simply had married a wife who wanted a little more luxury in their lifestyle. James Wilkinson, I think he was rotten to the core. But he was so good at what he did that it was hard to get him in trouble for it. He had 2 different court-martials I'm aware of that he was exonerated for. And one historian later said that he was the only general who never won a victory in battle, but never lost a court-martial. So, not really an epitaph for your best generals in history. But the keys to this exploration were these rivers of empire. And you'll see that not only did the Mississippi and the Missouri form one of those branches, but also the Platte, the Arkansas, and the Red. And these rivers are going to capture Jefferson's attention, and he wants to make sure that he has good intel so that when he justifies this to his political opponents and also cheers and tells all of his friends about it, that he can make the best case possible. So these are just a few of the expeditions that we'll look at during this short 5-year period of time that are launched by either Jefferson or Wilkinson to explore the Louisiana region. Lewis and Clark, of course, are the most well-known. We'll start with them. But then some that you may or may not have heard of, like Hunter and Dunbar, and Freeman and Custis, and the Platte one was never formalized, but will eventually be picked up by Stephen Long around 1819. And then the ones authorized by James Wilkinson, Philip Nolan, some of you have no doubt heard of Philip, and then the 2 Zebulon Pike. So we'll spend some time with these. So Jefferson sends out some explorers. Lewis and Clark are sent. And as I mentioned before, Spain had held the territory, now the Oregon country, for quite a period of time. But now with Lewis and Clark moving in to explore the Pacific Northwest, there's some attempts by the Spanish to arrest them and to detain them. The map by Nicholas King of the western part of North America is one of my favorites because, I don't know, the GLO folks can probably back this up. I've seen hundreds of maps, and I've only seen one that has this word written on it, and it says conjectural. Cartographers just don't write, I don't know, on their maps. You don't get paid if you turn in your homework unfinished, but this was the map that they're carrying. And of course, this is based on a British map by Arrowsmith, and the British and the Americans in particular try to erase native cartography so that they can rename things in their own way. So Lewis and Clark are like Adam and Steve going out on the plains to rename all the plants and rivers and everything in their own names. Whether there were woolly mammoths and if bison that kind of looked like a funny milk cow, 6-foot beaver. I mean, there are tales of what might be encountered out there that were ongoing. Lewis and Clark are passing through 55 different Indian nations. And as they do so, they're collecting tokens of sovereignty left by other groups, like flags and medals and things, and they're replacing them with American ones. And again, this is this exchange of the right of discovery that we've talked about. Their mission was a commercial one. It was based in scientific observation, but they were to definitely find out the commercial enterprise because the fur trade was going to be what made it happen. Are you aware that the Spanish sent 4 expeditions to arrest Lewis and Clark? In 1804, Pedro Vial, who traveled all over the country and opened up trading routes between Santa Fe and St. Louis, Natchitoches, San Antonio. He's employed by the Spanish, particularly by General Salcedo and a man named Charcon in Santa Fe, to go and arrest Lewis and Clark. His first expedition, he has about 50 men with him, and they make it to kind of central Nebraska before they turn around. That's the number 1 on the map. Then, after Lancaster takes over in Santa Fe, he too sends out Vial on another expedition to arrest Lewis and Clark. Unfortunately, his group of 106 are attacked by Pawnees who are defending their homelands along the Arkansas River, kind of down where Bent's Fort is today near La Junta. And so they return back. And then the third one, Pedro Vial sent again in 1806, and he has almost 300 men with him this time, and many of his men desert. And so this is an unsuccessful attempt too. The fourth one is actually launched by Lancaster and Salcedo again, and this one is led by a man named Facundo Melgares. And Melgares does take 605 men. I think there's 105 soldiers, 100 militia, 100 Indian auxiliary. Anyway, it was a huge enterprise. And they arrive at the Pawnee villages that had given so much problems to Vial, and they actually kind of negotiate at least an amicable impasse. And they provide them with flags and tokens and other things that they should do. Well, about a month later, Zebulon Pike, one of the other explorers, will arrive at that same Pawnee village and will try to replace those with American flags and tokens and things like that. Oops. The second ones, we'll finish up these parts quickly, is the Hunter and Dunbar and Freeman and Custis ones. Originally, Jefferson wanted to explore the Red River, but when Hunter and Dunbar applied for passports to go into this region, they were denied by the Spanish. They also learned that there was an Osage leader named Great Track who said that if any filibusterers or explorers come into our territory on the Arkansas, they will not return. So basically said, you come and we're going to kill you. Well, that was a deterrent for Hunter and Dunbar. They decided they'd rather go up and soak their feet in the hot springs of Arkansas, and so that's their scientific venture up the Washita River. Dunbar was a scientist. He had a plantation called the Forest near Natchez and a nice observatory. He was part of the Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. They're on the Natchez Trace. These maps of the tributaries of the Red, the Washita, were quite important ones. You can see their trek there through Louisiana and Arkansas. The next one we'll look at is the Freeman and Custis expedition, and this one does head up the Red River. They make it about 615 miles before a Spanish force led by Viana turned them back, and so this too is kind of a short-lived run as well. They do bring back about 267 plants and animal specimens that they codify for science. But we'll spend just a little bit of time now on the Wilkinson expeditions. You may have heard of Philip Nolan. He was a Mustanger and, more importantly, a protege of James Wilkinson. And he had been involved in a number of trips across Texas and Mexico in the 1790s. Probably his most famous expeditions in 1801, when he actually didn't have a valid passport at that point. There was a large lucrative market to capture wild horses in Texas and take them to Louisiana. You could make a good amount of money. So people in Natchitoches and Nacogdoches were very interested in this trade, and so that's where he kind of headquarters out of for that. We won't spend too much time on the neutral ground agreement except to see that our friend James Wilkinson was there. He had drawn a map of Texas in 1804 based on the intel he was getting from Nolan. And this brings us to our friend Pike. Pike's official instructions that are written say that you're going to, this is kind of a scientific thing, you're going to be collecting plants and bugs and things like that. His unwritten instructions are much more detailed. He wants to expel the British from the upper reaches of the Mississippi, and then later in the southwestern expedition do the same thing with the Spanish. So he explores the headwaters of the Mississippi, finds Lake Itasca after passing through a number of things. In lieu of time, I'm going to have to move quickly through that. But then when he gets back, Wilkinson tasks him to go on a southwestern expedition to find the headwaters of the Arkansas, because that had not happened with those Jeffersonian groups. And so he starts his trek. He meets those same Pawnee, and they have a discussion, and tries to take the Spanish flags from them, and they said, well, wait a minute, you've got 19 damn set of rascals here, and we just had 605 elegantly mounted Spaniards that just came through a month ago. What if they come back? We're going to have to fly the flag again. So he makes a compromise to fly the American flag while they're there, then they can take it down and put up another one later if they need to. The Pawnee are very astute diplomats, and they're like, okay, we'll let this guy stay for a couple days, and then hopefully he moves on like bad company. Eventually, Pike continues over to Pike's Peak, tries climbing the peak, and eventually makes his way down to Santa Fe. Before he gets there, he stops on the Conejos River, which is a tributary of the Rio Grande, and constructs a fortification or stockade. The Spanish learn of his presence. They go out, they arrest him. He's taken to Santa Fe, he and his men. And eventually Melgares marches them down to Chihuahua. And then eventually they come back through San Antonio, Nacogdoches, and all the way to Natchitoches. On this route, he basically gets the intel of the internal provinces of Mexico, which is what most historians believe he was tasked to do from Wilkinson's point of view, because Wilkinson was trying to launch an invasion of Spain, or of this region. And part of it, we'll get to his map here, was involving Aaron Burr, who had shot Hamilton because he didn't get a part in the play. And he establishes this relationship with Wilkinson. Now, can you imagine a vice president shooting a lawyer? Wait, that happened in Texas a little while ago. But Wilkinson does end up negotiating with Burr to try to separate this region from the United States, and with the intel that Pike is going to supply, perhaps set up a new nation with Wilkinson as the president and Burr in some fashion a leader in that. Of course, when news of this starts to come out, Wilkinson turns tail, gives all the goods on Burr, and eventually Burr is tried for treason, even though Wilkinson is a few years later as well. So, sorry about my timing and spacing. I have more detail than I can share. But my point will be concluded with this one. After Wilkinson loses several battles during the War of 1812, he's finally released or put out to pasture as the leading military general, and he becomes the envoy to Mexico. He continues selling military secrets, just like he had told the Spanish about the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Freeman Custis expedition and the Hunter Dunbar expedition, so that the Spanish would know where to send their troops to go capture these guys. And meanwhile, he's sending out his own expeditions at the same time, so just in case he's got to play one side or the other. But he eventually dies in Mexico City in 1825, trying to get some land grants in Texas for his service to the Spanish government through all those years. In 1854, he was uncovered as a spy. In the early 1900s, Thomas Roosevelt said that in all of our history, there's no more despicable character than James Wilkinson. So now you know the little story about one of the traitors in history. So, any questions? Better stop there.
I lost track of time, so just a couple questions real quick so we can get to our next speaker.
Is Wilkinson buried in the American cemetery?
Wilkinson is buried in Mexico City. Oh, I'm not sure which cemetery. Yes?
Was the Stephen Long that was commissioned to go out and explore related to James Long, that Wilkinson also had connections with him?
No, but he was related to James Wilkinson because Jane Long is the niece of James Wilkinson. And the McGee expedition in the 1812-13 period, he was a lieutenant under James Wilkinson. So he has his finger on that piece too. So basically, from the 1790s all the way through the 1820s, James Wilkinson is involved in almost every filibuster attempt of Texas, and he's also involved in the neutral ground negotiation, the Burr conspiracy, and some of the other things that didn't come to pass too. Yes?
One of Wilkinson's younger sons was involved in the expedition.
Oh, yeah, the son. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right.